I don't understand your complaints, exclaimed James as he got ready for work early in the morning. Are you suggesting I solve all the problems now? You've been bedridden for a whole year. Please keep in mind that I provide for the family. During this time, you haven't contributed a single penny to the household. I had to take out a loan on the house to pay for your treatment and medication, and now I have nothing left to pay off the debt. Therefore, I don't see any other option but to sell the house. Audrey had been unable to walk for a year after falling on ice and becoming paralyzed. The doctors had given no hopeful prognosis. Unfortunately, your wife is unlikely to ever walk again, the doctor stated. We did everything we could, but you must understand that she requires careful care. If you take her home instead of putting her in a special clinic, you will need to hire her a good caregiver. James couldn't believe his ears. Everything the doctor said sounded like a sentence for their family. How could they talk about hiring a caregiver when there was only one breadwinner left in the family? Their children had grown up and were studying at the university. They could not help financially. James never had a high income, and they always lived on 2 salaries. For the last year, he had been working wherever he could, but there still wasn't enough money. Because of it, he often quarreled not only with his wife but also with his mistress, Laurel, with whom he had been together for many years. Now, James could not juggle 2 women. If before he always had the opportunity to set apart part of his salary for gifts and leisure for his mistress, now he didn't have a penny left at the end of the month. And how are you going to deal with the loan? Laurel asked, sounding dissatisfied. Do you really think I will wait for you forever and put up with all this? Before, you used to give me gifts and flowers, and now what? I haven't seen a box of chocolates from you for a whole year, not to mention something more serious. This can't go on. They had been dating for 10 years, and during that time James never found a convenient opportunity to talk to his wife. This is how he always explained to Laurel, who was waiting and hoping that he would finally leave his family. Yet James himself wasn't sure if he wanted that. Laurel was far from household chores and family life. She never cared about anyone but herself. When James came to her for the weekend, which she allegedly spent with friends on a hike, at a bathhouse, or fishing, he saw how she lived. His wife Audrey was the complete opposite. For 20 years of married life, she got up an hour earlier every day to prepare breakfast for him, made a delicious lunch to take to work, and made sure he always had clean shirts and socks. Audrey was the perfect wife, and Laurel was a woman with whom it was always pleasant to spend time. Even when their grown-up sons left for the capital to study and no longer bound the spouses, James was not ready to give up the life he had become accustomed to. He understood perfectly well that Laurel was unlikely to provide him with the same comfort, so he lived with 2 families. Besides, he managed to hide his affairs well. After all these years of infidelity, Audrey never even suspected her husband was unfaithful to her. But everything changed after Audrey's injury. James now had to not only work for 2 but also take on all the household duties. The caregiver he had hired for his wife only served her and asked for an extra fee for everything else. When I hired you, you said you could cook meals, right? Asked James. No problem, of course I can, but only for an extra fee, answered the heavy, tall woman. However, James couldn't afford to pay more. Laurel quickly grew bored with the whole situation. She wasn't so jealous that James often stayed at home on weekends, but rather of the lack of any incentive to continue the relationship. She was no longer so young, but at 35 years old. She looked quite attractive and could find a more worthy man than James. Before Audrey became ill, James was neither rich nor particularly promising. Laurel met him on her property, but he regularly gave gifts and paid her bills. When they spent time together, they always had something to talk about. At a certain point, Laurel began to think more and more often that he suited her and she could marry him, but she was not going to be a typical wife under any circumstances. Even since college, she had been contemptuous of young guys who waited for marriage like manna from heaven to get full service from their wives. "And what kind of mothers have only brought you up?" she used to say to her classmates. "Look for some simpletons who want to serve you. You demand to pay for the apartment in half and that the woman pay for herself, because we have equal rights. And as soon as there is a question of who will stand at the stove or clean the house, the woman should do everything. This is absurd. Laurel's classmates agreed with her as she always had authority in the group and was the soul of the company. However, a significant number of young people preferred to avoid her and her friends. Immediately after graduating from college, Laurel got a job as an economist, and a few years later, she took out a mortgage. She was not against relationships, and before James, she had other men, but domestic slavery and other delights of family life were not needed for her. On the weekend, I'd rather lie at home and read a book than clean, carry groceries, and then stand at the stove, she thought to herself. She met James by chance. He was waiting for the bus late in the evening, and she came to the same stop. After some small talk, James and Laurel found out that they worked in the same business center but on different floors. Since then, they began to drink coffee together and go to the canteen. James didn't even notice how he fell in love, and Laurel found a version of the relationship that completely satisfied her. James never came to her without a bouquet or empty-handed, while he hadn't given Audrey flowers in several years. Why the extra spending? We have a small income, he always thought to himself. He considered it abnormal to buy such expensive flowers for his wife, yet he always gave Laurel at least 15 roses. Audrey knew that sometimes he took money from their savings but didn't pay much attention to it. After all, they had a family and everything was in common. She never once dared to ask her husband what he took such sums of money for every weekend. Most likely he's hanging out with his friends, she thought to herself. Cheating never crossed her mind. They had been living together for too long, raising 2 children. Their lives were relatively happy but not without nuances. However, what family doesn't have conflicts? They fought very rarely, always trying to find mutual understanding. After several years of being in a relationship, Laurel realized she wanted more. Regular meetings were no longer sufficient for her. She wanted James to be constantly with her. When she first talked to him about divorcing his wife, he reacted very categorically. "Baby, why all these formalities? We have children, and they have always considered our family perfect. Do you want them to suffer?" he asked, obviously appealing to pity. Of course, Laurel did not want to destroy the family, and she didn't want James and Audrey's sons to experience pain. They always considered their father and mother an exemplary couple. The divorce of their parents would be a real blow to them. However, after moving to the capital to study, Edward and Roger already felt less attached to their parents. They had their own friends and interests. Therefore, when their father told them what had happened to their mother, they didn't even bother to come. "This is all terrible, of course, but please understand us too." Roger spoke to James as an adult and conscious person. "We have exams now. We physically cannot drop everything and come. If we are expelled, we can only be reinstated in the paid department, and we have no money. You understand this perfectly. We have worked so hard to get here. As soon as we can, we will definitely come." However, during the first 6 months, Edward and Roger only visited their parents once. After spending a few days with their paralyzed mother and exhausted father, they began to pack up and leave. "Are you leaving so soon?" James asked in surprise when he saw his sons packing their suitcases in their room. "Well, yes, Dad. It's summer," Edward replied. "Life doesn't stand still. Do you know how many jobs and vacancies are available in the city right now? We'll earn a good amount over the summer. Maybe we'll be able to find a part-time job that we can combine with our studies so we can move from the dorm to an apartment." "So you were just going to leave your parents like that? I thought you would help me." James was taken aback by his son's decision. He expected more sympathy and compassion from them and hoped they would take a more active role in the family's life. But his hopes were in vain. "Dad, don't be angry with us. We understand that you and Mum have problems, and we feel sorry for her. But will it make her feel better if we get expelled and have to come back to this hole? We will be left without education, without work, without a future." Audrey fully supported her boys and was sincerely grateful to them for coming to visit her. But James was very dissatisfied. "Just look at who we raised. They grew up as egotists, thinking only of themselves. Their mother is sick, and their father is struggling to make ends meet. They came to visit for only a few days and then went back to their lives in the capital. Good sons would return home to help their parents. Maybe you'll calm down, Audrey asked sharply. For the first time since she was bedridden, Audrey allowed herself to raise her voice at her husband. Before that, she had tried to behave calmly because she felt a strong sense of guilt for her helplessness and inability to work. But the way he spoke about their sons injured her deeply. "What did I say that was so bad?" James protested. "And by the way, where is your mother? She lives 2 stops away from us and hasn't visited once in all this time. She could have moved here and taken care of cooking, washing, and cleaning. I would save money on your so-called nursing, and I would get a break from all this household fuss, which I haven't left for over a year. Or do you think I don't need to rest?" Such scandals had become commonplace in their family. James's criticism of Audrey's mother hurt her deeply. Mrs. Marshall was already an elderly woman, and due to her extra weight and other illnesses, she could hardly take care of herself. She needed help, not to be exploited as a caregiver. On the contrary, Mrs. Dossett, James's mother, was still in the prime of her life and had no health problems despite being the same age as Mrs. Marshall. She worked and lived for her own pleasure and did not believe it was necessary to help her son's family. When James asked her to come and help with the household, Mrs. Dossett chirped on the phone. "James, I understand everything, but what do you want from me? You're already a grown man with 2 big healthy sons of your own, and you want your mother to come and clean your floors. Come on, don't you find that funny yourself?" She had little interest in her sick daughter-in-law. Since Audrey's fall on the ice, she had come to see them only 4 times. She drank tea, nodded sympathetically, but there had never been any real and concrete help from her. Even when James asked his mother for money to pay off his loan, she jokingly but categorically refused him. "Mom, please understand me too," James complained. "I work until I can barely see the light of day. The doctors haven't given any positive prognosis about Audrey's health. Most likely, she will never be able to walk again, but we still have to pay the loan. I can barely support my family. I know you have decent savings after Dad's death. Please help at least to close this issue." "Son, what are you even talking about?" his mother replied. "What savings?" "Yes, I won't hide that I inherited some money after your father's death, but you should understand that my pension is not that big, and I still need to live somehow. And I'm not young anymore. Who knows what I might need? But you should thank me for insisting that your father buy you a small but separate house." After this conversation, James mentioned for the first time that he wanted to sell the house. "Audrey, I can't do this anymore. Honestly, I've almost decided to sell the house. I don't see any other way out. I can't work as hard as I did all this year while you're bedridden. I can't keep up with this pace. I'm only 41 years old. I'm not planning to die," James said harshly. Audrey was shocked by what he was saying. She was at a loss and didn't know what to say at first. She had always thought that her husband was her support and anchor, but now he seemed like a stranger who was only interested in money. "What about me?" she asked, bewildered. "Where will I go to live?" "You'll go to your mother's. I don't see any problem with that. She has a comfortable house too. The 2 of you will fit in just fine, and I'll go to my mother's. I'll come to help you and give you money, but I can't live like this anymore. After all, the house was bought with my parents' money long before you appeared in my life. Therefore, I have the right to decide how to dispose of it. I don't even have to consult you. My mother is a sick person. I will be a burden to her. You have the right to live here for as long as I allow you. If you haven't understood that, then I'm sorry," James said coldly. "It's not my fault that you're clumsy and don't watch where you're stepping." James shouted angrily. "If you were more careful, you wouldn't have fallen and received such serious injuries. Anyway, I've said it all. I'm still going to sell the house. If you don't live on your own, I'll sell it with you in it. By law, you have no rights to it. The new tenants who buy the house will kick you out." After these words, James slammed the door loudly and went to work. He didn't come back home to spend the night, leaving Audrey all alone. "Father, what's going on over there?" Edward exclaimed over the phone the next morning. Have you decided to leave our sick mother to the mercy of fate? I don't understand how you could do that. You've been living together for so many years. Why is Mum calling me in tears, saying that you're kicking her out of the house? What gives him the right to teach me about life all of a sudden? James thought angrily to himself. Son, you and your brother are living peacefully in your capital. Then mind your own business, James answered harshly. You have no right to dictate to me how to behave, given that you know nothing about our problems. Your mother has nothing to do with this house. My parents paid for it in full long before I even knew your mother. James slammed the phone down and punched the nightstand loudly. Can you imagine? My son called me to teach me about life. Such outrageous impudence. James continued to rant, looking at Laurel, who had just opened her eyes. Why couldn't they have called a couple of hours later? The woman protested. What audacity to call so early on a day off! James fully shared her indignation. He hugged Laurel tightly and closed his eyes. Listen, let's go somewhere far away from here, Laurel suddenly suggested. I'm tired of this grayness and dampness. Let's go to a warm resort town. We'll rent an apartment there, rent out mine, and live quietly. Great idea, James agreed. The only question is, what will we live on there? Oh, come on. Do you think there's no work there? Everything is the same as here. We'll definitely find something, and we'll have enough money for the first while. You'll sell the house, and some of that money will go to pay off debts. There will be something left, and we'll live on that money for the first while, and then we'll figure it out. James liked Laurel's idea. He too had been thinking that after selling the house, it would be nice to go somewhere far away from this city so as not to listen to his mother-in-law's and wife's reproaches. Most likely, Audrey had already called her mother and complained. James was right. When he arrived home, Mrs. Marshall was already sitting at the kitchen table, looking at him with anger. How dare you go somewhere at night and leave my girl alone? Mrs. Marshall said in an outraged tone. Do you even realize that she's handicapped? A person who is unable to act? Anything could have happened to her. You have no shame, no conscience. You're an egoist, James. If I'm such an egoist, then take your daughter and leave my house. James tried to talk to her calmly but still burst out in anger. I don't remember you calling me an egoist when your daughter married me and moved into the house my parents bought. Everything was fine then, but now, when I ask for just basic support and help, because I can't cope with the life circumstances I find myself in, suddenly I'm a selfish person. Excellent position, Mrs. Marshall. Just braver. Mrs. Marshall shouted back, You've been lazy your whole life. Tell your lies to someone else, and don't you dare talk to me in a raised tone. I can shout so loud that you'll go deaf. You've lived your whole life without thinking about anything, thanks only to my Audrey. She did everything, cooked, cleaned, took care of the kids, and managed the whole house. You didn't lift a finger your whole life. You just went to work, and on weekends, you were always out with your friends or maybe even worse. Well, she's my wife after all. Who's obligated to clean and cook, me? James replied. Of course, maybe for those men who provide for their whole family, wives have some obligations, but not for you. You've earned peanuts your whole life. Now you even have to sell your house just to pay off your debts. He wanted to hit her but restrained himself and sat on a stool across from Mrs. Marshall. James tried to speak calmly, but it was difficult because of the boiling anger inside him. I just said that I would do it. Why did everyone react so aggressively? Don't I have the right to dispose of my property independently? I would like to point out that in normal families, both the husband and wife work, and for the past year, I'm the only one working. I understand that situations in life can be different, and we had something like this happen to us, and no one is to blame for it. But why don't I have the right to be relieved of this burden? As soon as she became disabled, did you immediately consider her a burden? What if something like that happened to you? Audrey would never leave you. I'm sure of that. And what about you? Shame on you. Okay, sell your shack, and I'll take my daughter from here tomorrow. I just need someone to help with transportation. No problem. I can help, James said calmly, glad that the situation was finally resolving in his favor. The next day, James helped Audrey pack her things and took her to Mrs. Marshall's house. "Mum, how could he do this to me?" Tearful Audrey asked in confusion. "I thought until the very end that he wouldn't kick me out. How could he treat me like this?" "Darling, don't cry, please," Mrs. Marshall comforted her daughter. "You can't afford to be nervous. You have to think about your health. Let him do what he wants. What difference does it make to us? He doesn't want to take care of you, help, or support you. I promise he'll live just fine without you. Let him go in every direction." "Mum, I won't divorce him," Audrey said firmly. "I don't want us to split up completely. He'll come to his senses, come back, and ask for forgiveness." "I'm sure of it," Audrey said, her voice trembling. "Well, he didn't ask you for a divorce, did he?" "But if I were you, I would divorce him," Mrs. Marshall replied harshly. "What's the point of having such a husband? Just look at how he behaves and what he allows himself to do. Are you sure he doesn't have an affair with someone on the side?" "Mom, what are you saying? You're making up nonsense. I don't even want to hear about it. James has always been faithful to me. It's just really hard for him now. We lived together and seemed to live well, but now I'm disabled." "Do you think it's easy?" He asked his mother for money to pay off debts, but she didn't give it to him, even though she received all the inheritance from his father. Audrey protested. "There's a lot that your James wants," Mrs. Marshall objected. "Audrey, look at him objectively. He's a 41-year-old man with no car, no house, and no stable job. He's always been like that. You just don't see the reality because of your love. Your feelings have clouded your vision your whole life. When something bad like your accident happened, everything fell into place right away." Audrey was so emotionally drained that she couldn't think about anything but her relationship with James. Would he really leave her after so many years together? Would he really abandon her to the mercy of fate? She wanted to believe that despite selling the house, he would regularly come to her and take care of her as he had done for the whole year before. She hoped that everything he had said was said in the heat of the moment. But with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that James had no intention of supporting his wife. In several months, he had not come to see her or even called. One day, she called him herself. "What are you calling for? What do you want from me?" James shouted into the phone. "Isn't it clear that if I haven't called you or visited you in all this time, I don't want to talk to you now? Is that so hard to understand?" "I just wanted to know how you were doing," Audrey replied through tears, "and to ask why you don't come or call me. I thought." But he didn't let her finish. James really didn't want to explain himself to her. He had already found a buyer for the house and was only thinking about how to leave this town as soon as possible. Regretting what he had said, he apologized to Audrey and once again blamed his tiredness. "Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to hurt you in any way. Just please understand me correctly. Over the past year, I've been exhausted. I'm not going to leave you or divorce you. We've lived together for so many years, it's not necessary. I just want to rest and be alone," James said before hanging up. Despite the unpleasant conversation, Audrey felt a strange comfort in hearing his voice after so many months. Her sons now called 3 times a week, a significant increase from their previous once-a-month routine. Although her physical condition didn't improve, the support of her mother and sons bolstered her mental health. "We should think of a hobby for you," Mrs. Marshall suggested one day. "You used to knit well, didn't you?" "Mom, you're kidding," Audrey replied with a smile. "That was back in high school. It's been ages since I held knitting needles. I could hardly knit a sock now without mistakes." "We'll see about that." That same day, Mrs. Marshall struggled to the market and bought her daughter some wool and needles. Audrey picked up her once-favorite but long-forgotten task and realized she hadn't forgotten a thing. "Well, you see. And you were worried," Mrs. Marshall said, smiling. "Now I'll make us some tea." Despite her fatigue and health problems, Mrs. Marshall took great pleasure in caring for her sick daughter. Under her mother's wing, Audrey's psychological state gradually improved. To distract herself from the daily monotony, Audrey started blogging. She inspired others in similar situations to enjoy life and strive for something more. Meanwhile, James finally formalized the sale of the house. "Well, Mom, we're leaving," he told Mrs. Dossett on the day the deal was finalized. I'll pay off all my debts tomorrow, and finally we'll be able to leave." "Who's we?" his mother asked in surprise. "What are you up to, and where are you going?" "It's me and my girlfriend Laurel. We've decided to temporarily live on the coast." Mrs. Dossett looked at her son with wide eyes. "What about Audrey? Are you planning to divorce her?" "Mom, why all the formalities? We don't live together anyway. Running around doing paperwork is not a good idea. Besides, she's handicapped. I could be forced to pay alimony, so divorce and litigation are not in my plans." "How long will you be gone, son?" "I don't know yet, Mom. I just want to live in a warm and beautiful town for a while. If I'm lucky enough to get a job there, I might stay forever. You can come visit us, but you must understand that Audrey and her mother should not know where I am or with whom I left. We don't want any scandals or disputes. Doesn't this woman of yours want to be your lawful wife? Is she happy with just being a girlfriend?" "I don't know, Mom, honestly. She and I have only talked about it a couple of times at most, but she doesn't insist on anything. So probably she's fine with it. But as you realize, I'm definitely not going to marry her." A few days later, James bought tickets, and they flew out. Never before had he felt so light and free. At last, he was rid of the shackles he had been bound by for a whole year. Upon arriving in the southern town, they rented a modest one-room apartment. "It will be enough for the first time, and then we'll decide what to do," Laurel said, very happy that they were finally alone together. James's family no longer loomed on the horizon, and they didn't have to hide or meet only on certain days. Audrey hardly ever thought about James. One day she caught herself realizing that she hadn't thought about him in months. Her anger about the sale of the house and his behavior had faded. Deep down, she still loved him and feared hearing the same rough and indifferent voice as when she had called him to find out how he was doing. Edward and Roger were indignant at their father's actions. "What a jerk our father is," Roger said. "I don't know about you, Edward, but I don't want to know him anymore. How could he do such a thing?" "Don't judge, or you will be judged," replied his brother. "You don't know what you would have done in his place." "Well, I wouldn't leave an invalid wife. That's inhumane." "Okay, stop it. Mom will be upset if she hears our conversation. Let's agree to act neutrally towards him without any negativity so as not to upset Mom." "Okay, I agree. Actually, it's better not to talk about our father in front of her. Let him do what he wants. We're grown-ups now, we don't need him. We'll survive better without him and his occasional fatherly talks, which happened once a month at best. Besides, we never had particularly close relationships with Grandma either. Truth be told, when the grandchildren were born, Mrs. Dossett was still working and had no time for diapers and onesies. When she found out she had become a grandma, she joked, "Don't you dare call me that in public. I'm still young and have my whole life ahead of me." It was said in a playful tone, but there was a grain of truth to it. She didn't want to associate herself with her grandchildren or admit that the years had caught up with her. Mrs. Dossett was always a big fan of the high society lifestyle. She regularly attended interesting events, went on excursions to other cities, and socialized with her friends. She had no time for fussing with small children. Mrs. Marshall, on the other hand, always helped her daughter. When the boys were very young, she regularly babysat them. When they grew older, she often took them to daycare and then picked them up from school. "Mom, if it weren't for you, I don't know how I would have raised my children," Audrey said to her once. "If you weren't so involved in the lives of your grandkids, I would never have coped." Mrs. Marshall was pleased to hear these words. She understood that it was much harder for children to live nowadays than it was in their time. Finding a job was very difficult, and even with good education, experience, and skills, one could suddenly become homeless. She loved her daughter very much and always tried to support her, even though she never approved of Audrey's choices. She made an effort to behave very politely and correctly towards James. Looking at Audrey now, she truly hoped that someday she would stand on her own 2 feet. Mrs. Marshall was increasingly worried about her daughter, who had lost the support and backbone of her husband. Unlike her daughter, the wise, experienced woman understood that James had no plans to return to his sick wife. Mrs. Marshall was concerned for her daughter, but believed in her resilience. Little did she know, trouble was about to strike her family firsthand. "Son, it's been 3 years," James heard his mother's voice on the phone. "I have some bad news for you. You need to come to your hometown right away." "Mom, can you tell me what happened?" he asked. "I can't just drive back and forth like this. I'm working." For 3 years, James and Laurel had been living in a resort town. They'd both found jobs and rented an apartment together. Since the move, James had never once returned to his hometown, but he kept in regular touch with his mother. She had always been the closest person to him, and no circumstances or distance could hinder their communication. At first, Mrs. Dossett tried to tell him about his wife's condition during their conversations, but at a certain point, James forbade her from doing so. "Mom, I'm not going back to the past, so Audrey's life is of no interest to me at all," he said curtly. "Especially since she has someone to take care of her. I believe I owe her nothing." Sometime after the move, he changed his phone number and gave it only to his mother. He cut off contact even with his own sons. "Audrey is dead," Mrs. Dossett said quietly. "And my advice to you is to come to the funeral, because there might be something valuable for you too." "Mom, I don't understand you. What are you talking about?" James was annoyed by the mystery. "You're obviously not telling me something, and I'm not going anywhere until you explain." "James, I've tried to tell you about Audrey many times, but you didn't want to listen," his mother replied. "Now, I can't sum it all up in a few words. That's why I'm asking you to come immediately." "I don't need cryptic messages, Mom. Tell me everything straightforwardly, or I'm not going anywhere," James insisted. "What's with the unnecessary mystery?" "I honestly don't understand why I have to drop everything and come to the funeral of the woman I had nothing to do with for a long time," James protested. "Okay, look, you need to come for the inheritance. I hope that's a good enough argument for you," his mother replied firmly. "Ridiculous, Mom. What inheritance? Audrey didn't have a dime to her name. I was actually surprised she didn't divorce me and demand alimony for her disability support. How did they make ends meet there?" "James, there's a lot you don't know. A lot has changed in the 3 years you've been out of town. Audrey stopped being a beggar a year after you left. She's a star. Look her up on the internet. She has her own blog. You have no idea how much money she's been making from advertising alone, not to mention she created her own brand of knitwear that she sold online. She also had a bunch of local TV contracts." "James, you're not officially divorced, so you're a legitimate heir like your sons." After hanging up the phone, James immediately surfed the internet and was shocked by what he saw. He didn't use social networks in his daily life and rarely spent time on the computer, except for work. Sometimes he had to sit at his laptop for 14 hours, which exhausted him a lot. He found Audrey's blog and couldn't believe his eyes. She not only posted regular posts and pictures, but also made videos. Here she was trying to get out of bed on her own. Here she was putting on makeup and picking out clothes with the help of her mother. Here she was eating, drinking, and walking. This blog was her whole life. It turned out that when Audrey moved in with her mum and left without the support of her husband, she decided to create a blog. It helped her cope with the stress. Over time, Audrey found like-minded people. Initially, those who found themselves in similar situations for different reasons subscribed to her blog. But after some time, among her subscribers, there were also physically healthy people who admired her because she didn't give up despite serious trauma and was able to live on. Gradually, the blog turned into a business, and things were going so well that Audrey could hardly believe she had lived in extremely cramped conditions not so long ago. A year later, money was no longer a serious problem for Audrey. She launched her own courses, created a brand of knitted clothes, and sold handmade items on individual orders. However, a devastating blow came from an unexpected place. After another examination and tests, Audrey received a terrible and disappointing diagnosis. She had cancer. At first, Audrey couldn't believe her ears. She was sure that after enduring such a harsh winter and its consequences, fate would be favorable to her. But everything turned out to be precisely the opposite. Despite the doctors fighting for her life for months, the disease progressed rapidly. She was fading away before her own eyes, and Mrs. Marshall could do nothing about it. On the last day of her life, not only her mother and sons were by Audrey's side, but also a crowd of followers, people who had been touched by her openness in sharing the details of her illness. Through the window, she could hear their cries of support, and thanks to her mother, she even managed to look out into the street and wave to them. And in the evening, she passed away. Mrs. Marshall's heart edged with pain. When she got home, she collapsed on her bed and sobbed uncontrollably. Why is she gone? Her life was just beginning to get better. It's so unfair, she thought to herself. Mrs. Marshall tried to call James, with whom she hadn't spoken in 3 years, but found out his phone number had changed. She then called Mrs. Dossett and shared the sad news. I already know, Mrs. Dossett said calmly. Your daughter was a local celebrity. It seems like the whole town knows. Well, not everyone, but the most devoted Audrey people are already aware, Mrs. Marshall said, barely holding back tears. Please let James know as well. He's still her legal husband. It wouldn't be right to not invite him to the funeral. Of course, I'll let him know, Mrs. Dossett said before hanging up and dialing her son. As soon as she finished talking to Mrs. Marshall, Mrs. Dossett called her son. James pondered to himself, I wonder why she didn't think of this before. Then I wouldn't have had to live impoverished for so many years. It turns out that being disabled is more profitable than being healthy. Look at how much money you can make, flashed in his head. When Laurel heard the news, she was also surprised. But being pragmatic and cynical, she immediately began to coax her husband into not missing his chance. James, you need to behave yourself and not mess up your chance to inherit some money. Make a mournful face, she said to her lover while packing his things for the road. I will, but I can't imagine how I'll face Mrs. Marshall and my sons. I've been out of their lives for 3 years. I didn't help Audrey, and to be honest, I changed my phone number so they wouldn't call me, James said. It's just a little thing. Pretend that you've been working on your own goals all this time. You can even say that you've been living in a monastery all this time. If you behave properly, they'll believe you, no doubt about it, Laurel said, waving her hands. James boarded the airplane with a heavy heart. It had been a while since he had felt such emotions, but it wasn't regret or nostalgia. Instead, he found himself feeling a sense of incomprehension. Why had she only succeeded after he left her? James thought bitterly. He was angry about the fact that he had worked tirelessly for a whole year without breaks, believing she had been a heavy burden on him. He blamed her for not finding a way to earn money sooner, which would have prevented him from resorting to credit and selling their house. Little did he reflect on how he had squandered their savings on lavish gifts for Laurel, leading to financial strain and the need for loans to cover Audrey's treatment and subsequent house sale. After leaving the airport, James immediately hailed a cab and headed for his mother's house. Seeing her at the doorstep, he embraced her tightly, saying, Mom, I missed you so much. However, in the coming days he was to face people he had estranged from and who harbored no warmth towards him. Yet James was surprised by their restrained reactions. During the funeral and wake, Mrs. Marshall greeted James politely but distantly, acknowledging him only with a brief hello before stepping aside. Edward and Roger nodded at their father upon his arrival, but kept their distance, making it clear that years of estrangement had rendered him a stranger. They showed no outward disrespect, but maintained a formal demeanor. Mom, James started, seeking clarification. Who is that man standing next to Mrs. Marshall? I've never seen him before, some relative or friend. That's her father. I don't know why he's here. He's probably interested in the inheritance too. The last time he saw his daughter, she was still a baby, Mrs. Dossett replied calmly. Speaking of inheritance, James pressed, what are we going to do about it? Are you suggesting I stay here for 6 months to wait to inherit? I'd prefer to settle the matter quickly. It's too early to discuss money, James. You shouldn't rush into these matters, his mother advised. It would be improper to focus on inheritance so soon. James reluctantly agreed. He realized it was wiser to play his cards close to his chest and feign a desire to rebuild family ties rather than openly pursue his financial interests. That's right, Laurel chimed in over the phone. You attended the funeral, put on a sullen face, but that's not enough. You need to show genuine remorse for not being there all these years. Go talk to the boys, invite them out, spend time with them. Taking this advice to heart, James visited Mrs. Marshall's home where Edward and Roger were staying. The young men received their father with reluctance but maintained civility, inviting him inside. "Boys," James began tentatively. "I have to tell you something critical," James began sullenly, pouring himself a drink. "Your mum was an excellent person, and for many years we loved each other deeply. But fate treated her very cruelly, and coping with it was impossible. Let her rest in peace," he spoke sincerely, hoping Edward and Roger could sense his grief. However, they sat silently opposite him, their expressions unreadable. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and an elderly man with a weathered face stumbled into the room. It was clear he had been drinking heavily, which made him appear older than he was. "And who is this?" James asked, squinting slightly. "One more guest." Edward and Roger looked uncomfortable with the man's arrival, but reluctantly tolerated his presence in their home. "I'm Audrey's father, Gordon," the man slurred, his words thick with alcohol. "And you're her husband, right? So you're my son-in-law. Well, we finally meet." Gordon approached James closely, placing a hand on his shoulder and exclaiming, "Let's toast to Audrey." James poured glasses of clear liquid as Mrs. Marshall arrived. Her grandchildren retreated to their rooms, leaving her to join James and Gordon at the table. "So you're still drinking," she said reproachfully to Gordon. "And you, son-in-law, have shown up. I wish I never had to see you again." It was the first time since the funeral that Mrs. Marshall expressed her true feelings. "You've been away for 3 years, and now you come to mourn and make a spectacle of yourself as if you were devastated. You should be ashamed." "Helen, don't insult my son-in-law," Gordon interjected, standing up for James. "At least I've finally met him. We never crossed paths before today, which isn't right." "I shouldn't have called you to the funeral in the first place," Mrs. Marshall retorted angrily. "You're just as you were 40 years ago when I left you." "Oh, Helen, you're too harsh," Gordon replied, his words slurring slightly. "It was you who kept me from Audrey. I was always ready to do anything for you and our daughter, but you ruined our family and left your husband to fend for himself. And as for my drinking, who hasn't sinned in our time? A sober man is hard to find, and I've always worked hard." Mrs. Marshall listened with a mix of disgust and regret, recalling her impulsive marriage to Gordon. In the early years he was a different man, but soon his drinking escalated. There were times he staggered home from work, barely standing, yet his job overlooked his behavior as long as no accidents occurred. Life became unbearable after Audrey's birth, with Gordon becoming volatile. There was one occasion he had beaten Mrs. Marshall so severely she struggled to get out of bed the next day. After that, she fled to her mother's to safety. As the tension mounted in the room, James remained quiet, absorbing the complicated dynamics of Audrey's family, unsure how to navigate the emotions swirling around him. She saw no other way out. Her mother had always been firm with Gordon, and when she swiftly kicked him out and gave him a firm slap, he didn't push to continue their life together after the divorce. Gordon never saw his daughter, Audrey, again, and she rarely asked about him beyond her childhood years. Back then, Mrs. Marshall would put on a sorrowful face and say he had passed away long ago. After divorcing Mrs. Marshall, Gordon married twice more but never had children, which didn't seem to bother him much. Mrs. Marshall wasn't sure why she called Gordon to tell him about Audrey's death. Maybe it just felt wrong to keep such an event from him. It wasn't a celebration or a birthday. It was a significant moment, like a birth or a wedding. Gordon scraped together some money from his part-time job and attended the funeral. He seemed less concerned about Audrey herself than about what he might inherit. When Mrs. Marshall shared details about Audrey with her ex-husband, who she hadn't seen in over 40 years, he listened without showing much emotion. "All that Audrey was," Mrs. Marshall lamented. "Look at these socks she knitted. She was such an exemplary daughter, but fate treated her so cruelly." Mrs. Marshall believed both Gordon and James, Audrey's legal husband, had come to give her a proper send-off and closure. However, she was unaware that their motives were primarily financial. The day after the funeral, Roger approached his grandmother with a serious concern. Granny, when is he leaving? Roger asked. I can't stand his drinking every day, and now he's found common ground with our father. Are they going to drink here every day now? Both Roger and Edward were deeply upset by the situation. Unlike their grandmother, who wanted to see the best in everyone, they understood why their father had suddenly reappeared after 3 years of neglecting them and their sick mother. How can we just let him stay? Roger continued indignantly. He came to say goodbye to Mum. Please, can't we just endure him for another week? It's been 9 days already. We've remembered Mum, Edward added, and tomorrow they should leave. I highly doubt that, Roger retorted. And don't you see why they're really here? It's obvious they're here for the money. How dare you speak like that? Mrs. Marshall exclaimed. You're a cultured and well-mannered young man. Behave yourself. I am behaving, Roger replied firmly, though respectfully. I suggest you tell them the whole truth, and you'll see how they react, Mrs. Marshall advised. They'll find out eventually. Why rush to tell them now? So they won't linger around here for another 6 months, waiting for their inheritance. What's the point? One is a complete alcoholic, and the other, well, I don't even want to talk about him. Roger, you can't do that. James is your father, after all. He and Audrey lived together for so many years. Can't you just let it be? Yes, Grandma, I can, and I really want to. My brother supports me completely. We don't need a father like that. We've seen what kind of man he is. Despite his grandmother's pleas, Roger remained firm in his decision to announce who would inherit his mother's fortune. Edward fully supported him in this stance. Roger's announcement came as a complete shock to both James and Gordon the next day. He declared his intention to settle the inheritance question once and for all, prompting those who were only there for money to leave and never return. It turned out that Audrey's blog and all her assets were legally transferred to her sons, and technically she had left nothing else behind. What a disappointment, James thought to himself as he listened to his son's impassioned speech. Unlike James, Mrs. Marshall wasn't concerned about inheritance. She was confident that her old house would suffice for the rest of her life, and she knew her grandchildren would never abandon or harm her. James wasn't the only one outraged. Audrey's father also voiced his dismay. What the hell is this? He exclaimed, his eyes bulging. Won't I get a penny from my own daughter? From my own blood? How can this be? Gordon, deeply inebriated, began lamenting his plight, complaining about rising utility costs and his meager pension. Mrs. Marshall realized that Gordon's destitution wasn't due to high prices, but rather his excessive drinking. Helen, let's live together for old time's sake, Gordon slurred, barely able to stand. Mrs. Marshall's response was a bitter laugh, more hysterical than amused. The next day she escorted Gordon out of her house, bought him a train ticket, and sent him on his way. There's nothing more to be done now, James, Mrs. Dossett sighed, waving her hands in resignation once the truth came to light. You see how it is. Audrey evidently foresaw that you might come to inherit and took measures to protect her sons from that. Mum, I haven't told you the most important thing, James interjected. After the wake, my beloved sons approached me. They said Audrey had asked them to reimburse me for the money I spent caring for her and paying off the loan. They said I had reproached her with that money, and she owed me nothing now. I was just stunned. When James heard the news, he couldn't help but feel bitter. So what, son? If I were you, I'd say thank you. Any penny now is not superfluous. Don't spend that money recklessly, you'll figure out how to use it, his mother advised, trying to inject some practicality into his disappointment. Flying home with a heavy heart, James mulled over what Laurel, who had expected a substantial inheritance, would say to him. Worthless children. They didn't even share it with their father, James fumed. They tossed me this paltry handout like it meant nothing, no conscience at all. Audrey should have given me all the money I spent while living with her. That would have been fair. I worked hard my entire life, invested in my family, and instead of an inheritance, I get scraps, he continued, seething with frustration. Laurel was equally displeased with the outcome. She had envisioned James inheriting at least half of Audrey's substantial savings amassed over 3 years of stable earnings. Instead, he returned with mere pennies. It was then that she began to realize she was losing interest in him and reconsidered tying her fate to his. A month later, she calmly informed James of her decision to leave him and return to her hometown. Surprisingly, he accepted it without protest or resentment. He too had grown weary of life with Laurel, increasingly reminiscing about his time with Audrey, where life was peaceful, dinners were hearty, and the home was spotless. If only it weren't for that tragedy, things could have been different, James reflected, convinced that Audrey's trauma had shattered their almost perfect family life. Blind to his own faults and unwilling to admit mistakes, James remained stubborn and unyielding despite clear evidence to the contrary throughout his life. 3 years later, Edward and Roger completed their master's studies and settled in the capital, each forging their own path with respectable jobs. Despite their separate lives, they remained close and supportive of each other. Edward suggested bringing their aging grandmother to live with them, fearing she might need assistance soon. However, Mrs. Marshall adamantly refused. She found solace in visiting Audrey's grave regularly in their hometown, a practice she couldn't give up. Financially secure with the money her grandson sent regularly, she lived comfortably. After parting ways with Laurel, James had little choice but to return to his mother's house in his hometown. Unwilling to seek new employment, he lived off what he considered an unfairly small sum received as compensation for caring for his ill wife. Meanwhile, Laurel settled back into her apartment, finding a new job and ensuring she and James never crossed paths again. Edward and Roger, however, harbored no forgiveness for their father, whom they viewed as the true betrayer who had caused their mother's downfall. They maintained regular visits to their mother's grave and kept in touch with their grandmother, but never visited their father. James eventually stopped dwelling on memories of Audrey but never forgave his sons for not sharing their mother's inheritance with him. He firmly believed he was entitled to that money, oblivious to the ways he had wronged his wife, who by a cruel twist of fate remained incapacitated. But James never got the chance to understand this truth.